Everybody here. Thanks for joining us. This is a first-time event for the school, and I'm pretty excited to be a part of it, moderating this panel. And I hope that you guys are excited to hear what our panelists are about to share, and join us in the discussion. As we get these panelists going, I'll be sharing some slides for them. We're just going to start off with a few short presentations. After those presentations, I'll have a few moderated questions, and then we'll get into some audience Q&A where you guys are able to have conversation with these awesome folks that we've got prepared to talk with you guys. Hey, Len. Hey, Arlen.
Rand, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine.
Excellent.
Hi there, Felice.
Hey, how are you?
Hi, Felice.
Doing well. Good to see you this Wednesday.
Nice to be here.
All right, we're looking for Alex to kick us off. I've got his slides pulled up. So Alex has a combined career of teaching and practice, dedicating himself both in improving the quality of place and life in our major urban areas. And he's also the founding principal of Chan Krieger Steno. He's a professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he's taught since 1977, and he's served as chairman of the Department of Urban Planning and Design and director of the Urban Design Program. And he's also a frequent advisor to mayors and their planning staffs, and serves on a number of boards and commissions. And in September 2012, President Barack Obama appointed Alex to serve in the U.S. Council on Cities. So, Alex, I'll pull up your presentation here.
I didn't realize I was first. I thought I was second.
The floor is yours.
Really? Wow. Here I thought I was following somebody else. Anyway, well, thank you for inviting me to this. And I guess the title that was presented to me was, macro view of the American city in the post-pandemic world. Of course, I suspect that this was organized prior to, of course, the protests. So today, I think another issue besides the pandemic seems equally as important. We are confronted with three, sort of concurrent and not entirely unrelated crises. But those are not the only ones that are upon sort of American society. So it's hard to kind of focus on only those three. May I advance the slides, or are you going to advance the slides? Are you advancing the slides? Yeah.
You can just give me a next.
Sure. So for instance, besides the three involving the pandemic, the kind of economic sort of decline as a consequence, and of course also the sort of reawareness of persistent racism in this country, we've also been struggling with much rapidly growing inequalities. By the way, you might notice that I enjoy cartoons because I think that oftentimes cartoons or cartoonists have a quicker way to get to insight than sometimes politicians or pundits. So, of course, the increase in inequality is just as grave of a problem, not to mention the fact that we're continuing to ignore, other than through rhetoric, climate change and the consequences that surely will come about. In fact, you might say that the pandemic is the least of our problems because surely we will sort of move beyond that, although not soon enough to save as many lives as we should. The kind of the map on the right, I think, is perhaps the clearest way to describe the extent of our inequality. Remember that in the kind of the founder's age, in the revolutionary age, we were all promised a homestead by Thomas Jefferson. We were all promised 160 acres. An equal distribution of land across America was going to assure equality, egalitarianism, self-sufficiency, and all those good things. Well, guess what? If you look at this map, you realize that has hardly come about. And indeed, 1% would own most of the West that was supposedly going to be all for us. And 40% of us, and I assume that's most of the audience here, would own that little red dot collectively in the southern part of Texas. So again, when we talk about current conditions, there are many more current conditions that are sort of that are unfavorable at the moment than, of course, the three that we're most focused on at the moment. Now, I think that one of the things that sort of, I guess, was sort of requested for a comment, if you will, is whether or not the pandemic will cause a kind of a reemergence of suburbanization in this country. Now, of course, the realtors, as you can see, are predicting a mass move. Obviously, if there was no mass move, we wouldn't need as many realtors around. So, of course, they would predict that. What I would say, however, is that the realtors are not entirely wrong. I would simply just remove the mass from that sentence at the bottom of the page. And I kind of urge you to, just go back for a second. I urge you to kind of focus, if you can go back to that kind of wonderful photograph from the 60s. It was kind of an advertising photograph that suggests that indeed for some Americans, more than we would like to admit, avowed urbanists think that suburban existence produces some well-being. So now next. Now, it turns out, despite, again, the predictions of most kind of urbanists, millennials, who are supposed to be the primary group in support of recapturing our American interests in cities, actually have been leaving cities quite a lot. So while over the past couple of decades, we've been we've been reading books such as the one below about the end of the suburbs. Good luck, Miss Gallagher. That's not exactly happening. The suburb will certainly not grow to the extent that it did in mid-20th century. And since, because of course, most of us are there, but it's hardly going to go away. For example, the kind of headline on the left is from 2017, much earlier than the pandemic. And indeed, millennials have been moving to the suburbs, not all of them, but more than half of them, for two reasons. If you can go to the next slide now. This is sort of another, of course, a headline from the Wall Street Journal saying 66% millennials want to live in the suburbs. Now, why? Well, there are two principal reasons, and the pandemic happens to be a third. So now go forward once again. One is, of course, the unaffordability of urban living. Again, I like to remind people who somehow just assume that there's nothing good about the suburbs ever. Guess what? The most affordable form of housing for most Americans were created as a consequence of the suburbs. Obviously, we did not anticipate some of the kind of shortcomings of sprawl at the time. In this iconic photograph in the upper right, of course, you see a family moving into their first home, one of the most famous photographs, actually, of the middle of the 20th century. And guess what? When you look down below, you do not see titles like this anywhere in the country right now, right? Low-priced homes for any wage earner, right? And so, indeed, the problem with the problem for millennials is that if they want to move into kind of urban environments, it is very hard to find suitable, affordable living. And partially it has to do simply with space. It was certainly easier in 1950 to kind of lay out a couple more thousand acres and provide 70,000 new homes. Thank you, Mr. Levitt. It's very harder to achieve that when everyone wants to kind of live in the same geographical area. So next, please. And by the way, so one of the reasons for moving to the suburbs, back to the suburbs, is actually affordability. The other is kind of more subconscious. That is, we've long been promised, we've long been, the mythology of America is about sort of spreading out into a kind of a better environment. This is a little cartoon, of course, not the painting. The painting is a 19th century sort of American exceptionalism painting, right? There's Lady Progress heading away from St. Louis rather than improving St. Louis. We were all promised by Thomas Jefferson our own homestead. Now, we didn't quite get, each of us get a Monticello. We had to settle next, please, for a, next slide, please, for a quarter acre or an eighth of an acre. And for many Americans, this was a pretty darn good thing during much of the 20th century. So indeed, the pandemic, indeed the kind of the fear of density, which has been a part of American sort of instincts for a long while, will reoccur, and some will also do so out of this sort of longer kind of instinct in support of the American dream, occurring not in a micro unit on top of a Starbucks, but in a kind of a home on a proper lot in a quote good neighborhood away from the kind of stresses of the city. All right, so that's the kind of the bad news, if you will. Those realtors may not be wrong, although it will not be very many that will move because of the pandemic. Now, the other kind of temporary issue is that cities depend upon transit, and guess what? We will be much more loath to use transit for the foreseeable future. And guess what? That might bring back our love of the car, as Mr. Ford declared way back about 100 years ago. The fact that the cocoon of the car will seem safer for a while than even an Uber, who's somebody else's cocoon, or transit, will also, I think, lead to probably increased congestion as opposed to what we've been experiencing recently, which is a kind of a freer city to move around because, in fact, we don't move around as much. All right, I'm about to get to the good news, however. For those that are worried about, of course, the dissolution of the city, rest assured that is not going to happen. Predictions about the future as a consequence of a crisis, whether it's sort of atomic warfare, or whether it's the 9/11, or whether it's sort of cholera in the 19th century, have not come to pass. The city is not going away. And the actual reason for this is this little table down below, which is too small to read, and it's not so important, but it gives you a clue to why, in fact, the cities will sustain themselves and the suburbs, while not disappearing, will hardly grow substantially over time. If I were to ask the audience a question, which is about to be answered right here, that is that at the moment, if you look at a family, and we all think that Americans are made up of families, or humanity is made up of families, a family of two people, they could be gay, and one or two kids, and maybe a dog, what percentage of households that represents in America? By the way, if the question was being asked, say, in the 19th century, it would be well over half. If it was being asked, or an extended family. If it was being asked in the 1930s, it would still be over half. But the answer today is, as it says in this slide, is less than 20% by most actuarial tables. So what does that mean? What does that mean? Well, that means that 80% of households are not traditional families and are not so inclined immediately towards the kind of the suburban bliss. However, during a portion of one's extended life, and as we are growing, as we are living longer, and the young are staying younger, and therefore in no need of a yard and a lawn and a house and so forth, and us old people are hanging around the planet longer, knock on wood, the 80% of households are not quite as keen on a suburban environment. It doesn't suit their interests very well. However, during one's child rearing phases, which are becoming a diminished percentage across an entire life, the suburb is still a pretty darn good thing, especially if it's more affordable. And so the reason that 60%, another reason for why 60% of millennials, as they become households, are moving to the suburbs is that's the time of life, indeed, when the suburb still has a certain amount of appeal. But the fact is, it is hardly ever going to become more than 20%, and maybe not even all 20% of those. And that's why, of course, the predictions of mass removal from the city as a consequence of either a pandemic or other sort of crisis is hardly to happen, because, of course, the 80% of households want a lot of, for them, a lot of other different choices are actually much more attractive than suburban living, never mind the pandemic. So again, so for this mythical family, and one can sort of have photographs of millions of such, usually in front of their homes. The one in blue happens to be my niece and her young family, as David bought their first house in New Jersey. But next slide, please. But of course, for the other 77 to 82%, well, cities may still be likely to be the place where they still encounter the most important aspect of cities, which is sort of propinquity, which is a fancy word for being amongst other humans, which is certainly part of our DNA. All right, so I think I'm about to conclude. So as the Guardian shows, indeed, the temporary predictions on the one hand of some escape back to the suburbs as a consequence of the pandemic may occur. It is hardly going to occur at the state in which some predict. At the same time, the urbanists who say, well, we will get more bike lanes. Yes, you will. There'll be more investment in open spaces. Yes, there will be. Hopefully at the extent of what Seoul did in reintroducing its river, the lower image on the left. Hopefully, I'm not sure we're capable of doing that. But the important thing will be the ability to create more affordable housing in more constrained geographies, a very difficult issue. And of course, hopefully, as we are in this together, as we keep saying, the Himalayas will still become visible after the pandemic if we start to deal with some others of our problems. Now, for all the talk about sprawl, we are not sprawling as a nation, actually. We're sprawling within a finite number of metropolitan areas. And actually this map, which is of course the map that everyone should sort of keep in front of them, tells you actually a very unhealthy situation. The more we actually concentrate into smaller geographic areas, even though some of those are very large metropolitan areas, the more difficult it will be to overcome political disparities and other sort of differences among us. The less we actually deal with others, the harder it will be to form a more perfect union, as the beginning of our Constitution suggests. So, indeed, the cities will still remain quite important, and we'll try to make them much more livable. But another sort of wonderful cartoonist who points out that the cell phone doesn't reveal every aspect of racism, only a very small part of racism. And I end with the belief that, well, hold on a second, go back for a minute. Go back. There's a long list of crises which we must attend to, not simply overcoming the momentary pandemic. So now I will end with sort of my hero, or in this case, of course, a heroine, Jane Addams, who actually did something, not simply protest or wear a mask. She created an institution in support of social welfare and social justice. And so I'll end with the quote, which I think is an amazing one, which we should also try to remember. The good must be extended to all society before it can be held secure by any one person or any one class. But we have not yet learned to add to that statement that unless all and all classes are able to contribute to a good, we cannot even be sure it is worth having. Thank you for listening.
Get our speakers going through their presentations and then bring everybody else back on to have our discussion.
Very good.
So next up we have Arlen Stawak. Arlen is a passionate and forward-thinking architectural designer with experience in flood-resilient architecture and emergency disaster response systems. Arlen has conducted extensive research in the Netherlands, Bangladesh, Germany, New Orleans, and Miami to learn about the unique conditions of living with water. Arlen is the co-founder of the BSA's Committee on the Resilient Environments, and he's actively influencing Boston's resilient community. He graduated from the BAC in 2013 with a Bachelor of Architecture, is currently an adjunct faculty at the BAC, and currently works for Perkins & Will, serving as a resiliency strategist. Welcome, Arlen.
Thanks, Ren.
I'm going to have to pull up yours a little separate. That should not be there.
Okay.
So hold on just a sec. Let me make sure this is at the beginning. All right. There we go. You should be able to see our climate perspectives.
Yes. Rand,
take it
if
away.
you just go to the next slide.
Yeah, sure.
So there's essentially three talking points that I'm going to talk about. I was asked to kind of look at the spaces that draw us together from a very global perspective, a climate-focused perspective. So I'm going to talk about the current global issues and the environmental opportunities associated with those. I'm going to talk about a little bit about our responsibility as designers and how perhaps we can become the change that we wish to see with just some quotes that I've been able to find along the way. You can go to the next slide. So we all have seen the news. 2020 has been one incredible year. Its life has literally been put on hold. We have about 7.2 million cases confirmed of the virus, and we have over 400,000 deaths amongst many countries that are experiencing this critical downfall. Associated with that, we have 40% of the world that does not have access to basic sanitary services. This means that that 40% of the world does not have access to actually clean their hands as a part of preventing this disease outbreak. And access to water is more critical than ever before. And this is especially critical in slum areas. Parts of Africa are really having difficulty maintaining it, and it's becoming a major issue. So without water, there really is no life. This is something that a colleague of mine, Tyler Hinckley, and we really try to teach in our studio. And the more we try to control our water, the more, you can go to the next slide, the more our water controls us. And so the fact that we think that we can control our water is a big challenge. So this is a global view of the Earth. What you're looking at is the sphere of the Earth, but there's actually three blue dots, and I'm not sure how clear the photo is, but essentially there's three blue spheres that are on this map. The large sphere is the amount of salt water relative to the sphere of the world. The middle sphere is the amount of fresh water available, and there's actually a very small blue sphere, which I'm not sure if folks can see, which is our drinkable water. So we really don't really understand how fragile our water systems are. We have about 2 billion people in the world without enough water, and then we have another 2 billion people with too much water. And so these problems are detrimental, and we have the resources to tackle these issues. If you can go to the next slide. So what we need to wonder is why did this pandemic happen, and what are the lessons that we need to learn from this type of experience? You know, one thing I think a lot of us have noticed is that if we leave nature to itself, it sort of appears to rejuvenate on its own. Go to the next slide. We've seen better air quality in China, for example. And the next slide. We've seen better air quality in Los Angeles. Nature is just sort of taking back. We've seen cleaner canals in Venice. And we've also seen animal systems and ecologies taking over tourist destinations. These are hungry monkeys in Thailand, literally taking back part of the urban community. And also we're seeing uninterrupted ecological migration with turtles across the ocean as well. So these are turtles that typically do not, they typically move in the nighttime, and they're able to do that in the day because there's basically no tourists or people on the beach. So I think that this video that you guys had a short preview of is really relevant. And like Alex, I also have an appreciation for cartoons. So Alex, I hope you enjoy this one. And Rand, you can.
So Eliza, you can pull that up.
I personally love Stephen Cutts. I think his work is brilliant. I think he can really paint a pretty incredible picture. So it seems as though nature is really just trying to take this enormous breath, and maybe that's something we need to take into account. So what is resilience, and why as designers are we responsible? If you can go to the next slide. So putting resilience into practice, we have a duty as licensed professionals to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. This includes having an understanding of the built environment and how it could be impacted during a pandemic event. I think that this is really going to change the industry, and it's just something we need to take care of. You can go to the next slide. So the AIA is in full support of understanding climate change, the environmental degradation, and population growth, and they're also in support of these pandemic events. And so the mothership of our organization in the architectural industry understands that this is an important thing. So we need to see things differently. We need to understand sort of the triple bottom line, which is the social resilience, the economic resilience, and environmental resilience, which is people, planet, profit. There are, we need to understand challenges different. So there's acute shocks, and acute shocks are things that happen very quick, such as an extreme event. So for example, an acute shock for social, it is COVID-19, it is a disease outbreak. For economic, it is a cyber attack or a business closure. And for environmental, it's something as impactful as a tsunami or an earthquake. Go to the next slide. And understanding challenges further, we need to understand the chronic stressors, which are things that happen over a longer period of time. So for social, it's really understanding, low education and language barriers, homelessness, disease, and for economic related to COVID-19, which is a recession. Something that happens so quickly can have an impact also on the chronic stressors, which is where we are right now. And for environmental, it could be something as slow as sea level rise or water scarcity. So now that you all know this, you can't unknow this. This is a sort of a slogan we use at the company, Perkins and Will, and this is just something that we need to know. So it's become obvious that the human race is not in control of the planet, and nature will continue its course. COVID-19 is something that's so microscopic we can't even see it, yet it literally stopped us all at our fingertips. So we need to move away from this illusion that we are in control of the planet and share the resources with all life on the Earth. And so we need to design a new path forward. And this is our responsibility as designers, is what does that path forward look like? We need to continue our quest to learn from and work with nature's systems. And this is something that I've been thinking about, is what if every year the human race sort of had a planned lockdown to sort of give nature breathing space? Maybe there is something that we can take away from COVID-19. And this slide actually was inspired from a student of mine. We really need to understand our place in the universe. And so perhaps 2020, similar to the first slide that I showed, maybe this is really about understanding our place and rethinking the systems that are in play and how we live our day-to-day lives.
Great thoughts and great stuff to chew on, Arlen. There's this contact information if you'd like to reach out. And with that, we'll move on to our next speaker, Mark Walsh-Cook. Mark Walsh-Cook is a principal in Arup's Boston office with 33 years of experience in mechanical engineering design, analysis, and construction. He's worked internationally in Arup's Sydney and London offices prior to joining the Boston office. And Mark is responsible for managing multidisciplinary project teams and designing a range of building service systems. These include offices, courthouses, museums, and a wide range of academic buildings, including residence halls and science buildings. Welcome, Mark.
Hey, Rand, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, we got you fine.
Good. Well, good morning or good afternoon. I see there's some folks dialing in from all across the US, so it's good to see everybody. I should have also mentioned that I'm a trustee at the BAC, so it's great to be a part of this. And thank you everybody for dialing in. I also realize now that my presentation is woefully devoid of cartoons. So so apologies all, there's no cartoons or videos as part of this presentation. So I was asked sort of very specifically to sort of talk about the design of our own office, the place I used to go to about 13 weeks ago. Now you can see my office behind me. So we designed our space about 3 years ago, and we had the lofty goals of achieving LEED Platinum, but also there was this new idea coming out about designing for wellness and specifically the WELL certification. Now, you know, we've also got the Fitwell that I'll sort of touch on as well. So we wanted to design our office to meet both those requirements. We thought that would be good for us to sort of demonstrate that we walk the talk, but also, you know, really make a much more enhanced space for our employees, our staff who work there. So 60 State Street, for those of you not familiar with Boston, so you can see it in the background there behind Faneuil Hall. It's right, excuse me, it's next to the old State House. So, excuse me, so, you know, very downtown. You can see our office space, one of about 2/3 of the office floor. So we have about 16,000 square feet in our office. Go to the next slide. So really our goal, you know, I'm sure many of you are familiar with LEED. Version 4 came out obviously 6 or 7 years ago now, but in terms of sort of TI achieving LEED Platinum, you know, was definitely, you know, sort of out there and sort of very new, I think, to some of the subcontractors, and I say we wanted to balance that with a sort of the human side of the design outcomes. So, you know, we were very keen to achieve WELL. So our RFP, as the owner, we put out, we specifically said we wanted LEED version 4 Platinum, and we wanted to be WELL Silver. Later in the process, the Fitwell certification came out, sorry, around. So we decided that, you know, Arup was a sort of an early adopter of these certification schemes. So we also decided to sort of run through Fitwell as well, just to, you know, understand what that would mean for us. So that was our goals, and I think that really what it highlights to achieve these specifically, it really requires the collaboration of, you know, the owner, the design team, architects, engineers, etc., and the contractor, you know, to achieve this. You know, it was doing something new at the time, and to achieve this really required very close collaboration between all those three. The next slide, please. And specifically, I thought, you know, what we were thinking was the relevance of, you know, of what we did was, if you kind of look at the strategies there on the left, and I'll explain what the thing on the right is in a second, but if you look at the strategies and just think about the presentations you've maybe sat through, you know, on Zoom or, you know, Teams or your media of choice, and, you know, the things we were talking about, the things we incorporated are all being discussed right now, either as back to work strategies, or, you know, specifically to this talk, sort of post-COVID, you know, prepping for the next pandemic strategies. So, you know, thinking about, you know, filtration, you know, inspections, green cleaning high-touch surfaces, monitoring the air quality and feeding them, more importantly, sort of feeding that back to people so they understand that, you know, that they're going into a space that's clean, that's well ventilated. You know, monitoring. So the thing on the right is our little sensor kit. So we 3D printed this little kit. It's about the box on top is about sort of 10 inches square, and it's got all these little sensors on that sense temperature and humidity and VOCs and what have you. So we track all that. We move it around our office, and we track the conditions in the space. So you can imagine, you know, as we design new buildings, you know, wanting to have this, you know, a more aesthetic version of this, perhaps, that, you know, is in each space, so people that walking in can know that, you know, this place is being cleaned, that, you know, the air quality is good, the temperature is good, etc. The other strategies, so, you know, carbon filtration, so cleaning of the air in the air handling unit, you know, subsidizing gym membership. So this, you know, this whole idea of sort of holistic wellness, so not just you know, a healthy space, but you know, facilities and opportunities for staff to you know, eat well, to exercise, etc., etc. So, you know, all strategies that I'm sure you've been hearing about for the you know, the current back to work and the sort of the post-COVID world. Next slide. So as I say, our goal, you know, we achieved the LEED Platinum, we achieved WELL Gold, and we achieved Fitwel 3-star. You can see images of our office. You know, it's going to be interesting to see. You can see, you know, everybody in the bottom right is, you know, desks are all very close together. This shot, there's actually not very many people, so maybe this is a good shot of, you know, of us going back to the office. But, you know, the expectation was that people were sitting close together and collaborating. And I'm hoping that, you know, we get back to that. You know, I think, Randy, you were asking sort of questions about, you know what, you know, opportunities and challenges. So I do think one of the things we've all missed is that sort of human interaction, the personal face-to-face interaction. I mean, these Zoom calls are great, but, you know, it's no substitute for being in the same room and sort of collaborating closely. So I do hope we get back to that. And I think the next slide is probably one of the, you know, so we did pre and post occupancy surveys, you know, both the qualitative and the quantitative surveys. So you can see, you know, the productivity gains. Our old office was designed to achieve LEED version 2.1, I think, silver. So, you know, a reasonable office space at the time, but you can just see, you know, what people were saying about the enhancements in productivity, you know, the fact that they feel more healthy in the office, that the new office supports the creative thinking, you know, is energizing, inspiring, you know, all these metrics were just, you can see the, you know, an order of magnitude increase. So I really do think that, you know, this holistic approach to design, incorporating both environmental factors, which I hope we don't lose. We can't design every office building going forward as a hospital, you know, an infection control room. So, you know, we need to balance that environmental with, you know, health and wellness going forward. So I think that's it. Thank you, and certainly looking forward to a conversation afterwards.
And our final panelist before we get to our discussion is Felice Silverman. So Felice Silverman, FIIDA, is a principal at Silverman Trukowski Associates here in Boston, Massachusetts. She served as the president of the International Interior Design Association from 2013 to 2014 and served on IIDA's International Board of Directors from 2009 to 2016. She's been practicing interior design for the past 25 years with a focus on the design of interior spaces for workplace, education, children, healthcare, and fitness. She's NCIDQ certified and was the 2006/7 president of the IIDA New England chapter and served on the Boston Architectural College's Board of Trustees from 2009 to 2012 and from 2016 to 2018, and also as an overseer of the BAC from 2012 through 2016, and was also the chair of the BAC's Interior Design Advisory Board and Student Development Committee. She currently sits on the board of the Council for the Interior Design Accreditation, CIDA. She's a past president of the Interior Design Continuing Education Council and has served as a member of the Massachusetts Interior Design Coalition Advisory Council. She has been an educator and guest critic at many colleges and has served on numerous competition juries nationally. Felice is the co-chair of the BSA Women in Design Award of Excellence and a member of the Design Museum Foundation Center for Workplace Innovation think tank. She was elected to the IIDA College for Fellows in 2014 and is the recipient of a 2014 Design New England Mentors in Design MIDIs Award. Ms. Silverman received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from Harvard University in 1985 and her Master of Interior Design from the Boston Architectural College. Well, welcome, Felice.
Nice to meet you.
We're looking forward to hearing what you've got.
Great.
So
Well,
take it away.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. And I think that it's really wonderful to put together a panel representing so many different disciplines at so many different scales. And I'm going to take this conversation down to a very small scale now into the interior of spaces. But everything is related to everything you've heard so far. So, you know, the role of interior design is really equally important as all of the disciplines we've been hearing from, in a particularly complex one. Many of the challenges of protecting ourselves during the pandemic are on the inside of our spaces. And research shows that people spend about 90% of their time indoors. So as designers, we are responsible for understanding the guidelines and requirements that are coming out, as well as the data and the research, and implementing them into our design solutions. But the basic premise of all these new regulations is around separation and isolation. And it's, you know, to Mark's point just a bit ago, looking at their office, you know, it's the absolute opposite of everything we typically strive for in the design of spaces for people, right? We typically want to create these collaborative, engaging, welcoming, comforting spaces for people to work, gather, play, and learn. So now, while we don't know, I'm talking about this moment in time where we're in very responsive mode, we don't know quite how long this pandemic is going to go on and the new requirements are going to be necessary. But to me, it's already been going on long enough that as designers, we really need to jump on this and use our creativity to bring great design solutions to new complex problems. So you're looking at the what not to do, right? So we'll take a look at some of the design responses that, you know, to solving some of the pandemic-driven social distancing issues in interiors today in a couple of different settings. And I think you're seeing some pretty scary images right there. In workplace, the tendency, I think, is to put people in individual spaces, to create that high-walled cube and separated office zone. We've come so far in understanding how people thrive in a collaborative setting, working together in open environments, creating chance encounters throughout workspace, and giving people the choice about how and where they work. Do we really want to see people go back into individual cube spaces? Now, this image, of course, in the upper left is an exaggeration, but it's really not far from what could happen. I know there's a better way to do this. I know there's a more creative way to create separation that we need physically, but still have a collaborative environment. So now we also know there's a new need to communicate how people circulate through space, where they can and can't go, and how to keep the separation. So I'm sure everyone's seen images, or in real life, images of floor signage and arrows and messages on the floor. I think there's a better way we can do messaging without words and arrows on the floor. Childcare centers and schools are reopening in other parts of the world already, and they're soon to open in Massachusetts. Actually, some may have opened this week. And one approach I've seen in some photos that is really sad is what you're seeing in that upper right image, little dividers at each child's space. You know, these early years of a person's life, of a child's life, are so transformative, so formative in how they learn to engage with people, and we've got to find a better way to create design safe spaces that are still fun, engaging, and educational. And I think perhaps the creepiest image of all on this board is the restaurant image. Restaurants are actually solving the kind of empty look of their space. They're creating their social distance by limiting the number of people that can go into the space, and they're adding mannequins into empty booths and tables. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't want to actually be in any of the spaces on the slide. So how can we do better? So as we return to our interior environments, it's just so important that we consider how people feel, their comfort, and their mindset in these newly transformed spaces. It's so important to create a space that meets all the requirements, but without being a constant reminder that we are in a pandemic. You know, Mark mentioned, you know, we don't want these sterile kind of hospital feeling environments. We want it still to be a very comfortable space. So how do we do this? And it's using all of the tools that we know tried and true. We have so much research, so much we've learned along the way, so much in our design toolkits. Principles of biophilic design, incorporating nature into the design of space, have proven positive impacts on people. LEED and WELL building standards define criteria for creating spaces that focus on the health and well-being of people, and Mark talked about that, including not only the physical, but the mental health. So two of the WELL criteria that are so important for us to consider during the pandemic design are comfort and mind. Now, on the next slide, you'll see the very familiar image of 6 foot apart. There are many elements of pandemic and post-pandemic regulations that we need to comply with, and you've heard about many today. But I thought I'd just, in the few minutes that I have, take one of those elements and explore it in 3 different context applications, and that's the 6 foot space requirement. We all understand the rationale behind the 6 foot rule, but you can see how in my earlier examples, this could be a very limiting and rigid standard. So let's take a look at the 6 foot module in 3 different space types: workplace, childcare, and restaurant, and see what we can do better. So for workplace, as we saw in that first example, an obvious way to solve 6 foot separation is with 6 by 6 high paneled workstations. But how can we create the same separation in a more comfortable, creative way? What if the forms and edges of a 6 foot workspace were not straight? What if they were faceted or curved? Or if the path that they sit along meanders? The circles on this plan, you can see some green circles, represent a 6 foot space for each workspace, but in a meandering organic form, mimicking a winding path. And hopefully this gives a more of a comforting feel and more engaging feel to workers. Similarly, you're seeing in this set of images, the elements are separated from one another, are transparent, so that there's an opportunity to engage with colleagues. And you're seeing a lot of, plexiglass dividers come onto the market. But what if there were, patterns or plantings or something that can bring some delight to the space and branding to the space? Elements like these screens and planners can be used as space definers without making it feel like a formal barrier. In the workstation image, this is actually an existing space that we did, and we've shown now a concept for adding a decorative screen that will help create the edge, but still encourage people to engage. And on the lower image where you're seeing that organic floor pattern, using material and pattern to create zones of space and wayfinding might possibly replace arrows on the floor. In childcare example, at STA, we've been designing spaces for children for a very long time. And one of the goals has always been to create nurturing, fun environments while meeting the very strict regulations of childcare. And those regulations have just become much more stringent, incorporate rules around social distancing and group activities. And sadly, there is no more circle time. So how can we create a space that allows teachers to safely organize activities with appropriate distancing, but that is still fun learning experience for the kids? So in the image you're seeing there, the flooring is made up of a variety of 6 foot shapes and colors, teaching kids to learn about shapes, colors, letters, anything, while creating an overall environment that the children still want to be a part of. And then lastly, last example is restaurant. Creating the required distancing and barriers in restaurants is, I think, a particular challenge. Many restaurants get their vibe and their ambiance with tight, close quarters, you're squeezing up to the bar with people you don't know, striking up a conversation. They also rely on that density to be profitable. So now we need barriers, but maybe the barriers and edges can be a design opportunity. Can they be more than just a plexiglass screen that, again, is a reminder of the pandemic? Can they become part of the branding and the vibe of the space, incorporating millwork, pattern, lighting, plantings? These 2 images are on this slide are restaurants that STA recently designed, but where showed concepts for ceiling hung screen elements that coordinate with the aesthetic and the vibe of the spaces. And they'd be removable so that as ideally we move beyond this pandemic, things can go back to normal. So there's so much for us to solve as interior designers, and this is just one small example of how we might humanize the space one element at a time. So let's rely on our knowledge of healthy spaces, biophilic design, to continue to create great spaces that make people happy, productive, and collaborative, spaces that allow people to heal, to flourish and engage, and spaces that bring comfort, pleasure, and joy, especially in a very difficult time. Thank you.
A brief moderated discussion and then open it up for audience Q&A. So audience, if you want to go ahead and put questions that you have for our panelists in the chat, I'll be sure to label them as questions. Eliza, if you could stop my video and put our other panelists up, I can be a disembodied voice asking questions. And the first question that I've got for the panelists is really just about, the challenges or opportunities that you've been forced to deal with as a result of the pandemic that you never anticipated. There's so much going on now that there's really no way that we could have anticipated it. So what kinds of things are you finding difficult or really getting excited about in this time? I'll field it to Arlen first. Do you want to start?
Sure. Can you hear me, Ran?
Yep, you're good.
Can you hear me okay? I've been kind of struggling with this question because the challenges that I've had personally haven't really affected me that great compared to others. I feel like the challenge isn't really me. The challenge is the daily wage workers that are affected by the day-to-day that they need to get by. So I think about those folks who live in Bangladesh. I think about those folks who live in Southeast Asia and various parts of Latin America who are relying on a paycheck to put food on their table. And so I feel very lucky that I'm able to work comfortably from home. But the reality is there's just these huge social inequality gaps that are consistently growing and becoming worse and worse. And I think that a lot of what Alex was saying previously of this sort of economic challenge of distribution of wealth is just, it's an issue that needs to be solved. And perhaps this is the year to shake everything up. Business as usual is no longer an option. And maybe this is the opportunity that we need to see it as is, can we focus on shifting our economy towards our ecology? Can we find ways to invest more into nature and invest more into spaces that really bring us together, but at the same time, provide a sense of equality for all?
Alex, would you like to follow up on that? And I'd really like to get Felice's take after that.
Go ahead, Felice. Although, go ahead, Felice. I'm happy to go third.
Sure. Yeah, I think that, that it's really interesting. I mean, there's, as I was just saying, the challenges for, I won't speak personally, but for, our clients is this sort of overnight need to change, right? And so, the issues around, physically not being in the office and learning to work with technology. I think actually there's been a lot of positive and opportunity that has come out of that sort of crash course and having to figure this out quickly. I can speak from our firm personally that, learning to work remotely and learning to use the tools and learning to do things differently really quickly because we had to has actually been very positive. So I think there's a lot we can learn from that as we go back to whatever normal design is or normal times are after this. But the challenges have been more for, our clients who are faced with not only, we're able to work remotely, we're able to sort of figure this out because we can, but there's so many businesses, childcare, restaurants, where you actually need to be in the space. I mean, that's the whole point of it, the physical space is so important. And for them to have to pivot and transform so quickly has been challenging. So we've just been working really closely on all of these interim plans, and the other piece of the challenge in that is not knowing what's interim and what's forever, right? What are these things that we're learning now and things that we're responding to now are actually something that are long term or not. So in terms of making big future decisions about Next steps in investment in space, it's a little bit of a challenge just understanding, as everybody is right now, we don't know how long this is going to go on for. So the uncertainty, just as an umbrella.
About the large moves that need to happen or are happening. Alex or Mark, have either of you seen any large movements in the work that you've been doing since we've been hit with the pandemic?
Again, the large movements, as far as I can see, are the tens of thousands of marchers day after day after day. That seems a lot more important, actually, than the pandemic. I'm sorry to kind of harp on that. You know, there's a sort of dialectical moment right now, a dialectical kind of condition in our nation, perhaps around the world. On the one hand, yes, as Felice said, there are people who are struggling. There are people who need to kind of get back to business. They need to put up their plexiglass panels or more beautifully designed versions of this. And that's, of course, very important for many, many people, right? At the same time, going back to normal means going back to racism, to inequality, to unaffordability, to environmental disregard, to all those things that we don't want to go back to normal on. So one of the problems is trying to kind of, yes, get back to normal for those that are suffering the most in terms of their livelihood, but not to get back to normal, to quickly forget that the issues that are most difficult for our nation at the moment, and the world to some extent as well, is not how to fix the next bar, but how to try to overcome those things that have been growing over time to the point where now there are thousands of marchers that are on the streets. Yes, the marchers were instigated by a particular, horrible incident, but I think that the reason that they've been maintained for more than 2 weeks now has to do with kind of a deeper unleashing of realization that things cannot go back to normal. So then, of course, as Felice said, there's this kind of that's why I'm calling it a dialectical situation. A dialectical situation cannot be solved so easily. Solving the immediate hardships of people versus not necessarily forgetting that much tougher issues need to continue to be foremost as we move ahead into a different normality.
Yeah, I would just only add to that. I think one thing the pandemic has shown us, it's kind of completely redefined what we think is an essential worker, right? I mean, these people that have sort of kept us all going, we're all working nicely in our houses, and yet, somebody who's defined as an essential worker also in many cases is, sort of earning minimum wage. So, I think there's, if nothing else, is a huge time for introspection and sort of, as somebody says, not going back to normal if normal was inequality and racism, all those issues. So I hope, I think as was it Arlen's slide there, the reflecting on our place in the universe, following 2020, I think that's very important.
Well, I recognize that we've got about 30 minutes left, and I really want to give the audience as much of a chance to posit questions of their own. So I'll bring up one now. So David asked, what about the urbanization of suburbs as workers start to realize the benefits of working from home?
Well, the urbanization of suburbs, I guess I can start, has been occurring for, a couple of decades. In other words, we as much as I kind of said, the suburb has been a sort of an amazing contribution to kind of, affordable housing for much of the 20th century, we have learned the limitations of suburban sprawl as well, for sure. So the folks now, and even these millennials who want a house and want a yard and so want something affordable, don't want to kind of return to this kind of the isolated environment that the most generic suburban condition evokes in one's mind. So of course the suburbs will become a little bit more sort of mixed use. They have to. Of course they'll become a little bit more sort of full of amenities. Of course the kind of new urbanists, as they've been kind of proclaiming, will want to make little small towns, small self-sufficient towns out of the suburbs. All that actually has been happening already, and actually will continue to happen as a consequence of a little bit of pressure, again, on the suburbs, because indeed some folks will start to feel a little bit safer, at least for a while, in sort of avoiding whatever the densest portions of our environments. So I think that's a kind of a given, but it's not necessarily something new. It's something that has been happening, and it's a kind of a good thing, because the kind of the classic suburb, not the classic in the best sense of the word, the kind of most archetypal suburb, is actually not a very good place, actually, because other than enjoying one's own yard and home, there's not much else to do short of having to require mechanical transportation and this and that and so forth. So I think most Americans have realized that, even those who still may prefer a home as opposed to, say, an apartment in an urban condition. So indeed, the urbanization of suburbs will continue. Now, the second part of the question, and I'm sorry to be going on so long, is, 20 years ago, when the internet or digital technologies first surfaced, there's a prediction of greater dissolution, greater decentralization, right? Wow, we can live at home, we can work at home, we can be in the Montana, still connect to our kind of central office. Guess what? That is not what has turned out. And by the way, the pandemic has made us realize the limitations of working at home. So on the one hand, I think that a greater diffusion of population will occur. I hope in terms of the rest of the country, not just in a further suburb of Boston, because that will have another kind of social benefit. But clearly, the fact that more people will realize that at least for a portion of their day, they do not have to be in the same place with their colleagues will certainly have great implications for how we settle in the future. It'll have probably the most disadvantageous attempt on actually real estate Mongols, who will probably have to sell less real estate because none of us will need as much real estate, certainly in the commercial sector. And I wonder whether others will agree with that. If you only ever need half the people to show up, you don't necessarily need 100% of the space that you had before. And that will have a tremendous impact on the commercial real estate market, probably, at least in the short term.
Agreed, and that's one of the areas of uncertainty that I think is so in flux. And just working from our client pool, we're hearing everything from keep the space that we have because this is temporary. Then we're hearing keep the space that we have because even though half the people are going back, they need more space. And then we're hearing literally we are never going to go back to office space. And I've heard that from a few. So there are some, and it's. Again, it depends on the company and it depends on, the size and the circumstances and everything. But I think that, there's so much uncertainty around it. We will still need space. We will still need office space. It's going to be different though, and it may be more of a, a combination of smaller dedicated office space with other, shareable spaces. But I think that model is still evolving, is going to evolve. But we're definitely seeing people who are just kind of in a wait and see mode and not looking. The ones we're in design with right now, they're not asking us to change the design dramatically, but to think about this sort of things that I was talking about earlier, the sort of spatial conditions and sort of more subtle way of accomplishing some of the issues and solving some of the problems.
Yeah, the next embarkation for 1 million square foot, speculative office building may take a little while because until this uncertainty, right? Exactly. But those who say they'll never go back to the office must not have young kids at home.
Well, there's a ripple effect of it's not just as easy as that, right?
Right.
If you are going to be working from home, well, then you've got to do some things to your home office, and right. It's not a permanent condition that we're in now. And if it is something that is become a way of work, then people really need to assess their home office experience, and that becomes another design problem, honestly.
So kind of a follow-up question there. Heidi asks, how do you see the future of big building moves such as grand staircases and atriums post-COVID? So, as we talk about the office space and using staircases as a way for people to kind of mingle and cross-pollinate ideas in these public spaces within the office, or the atriums as a place where, we can, have visual connection and, just different kinds of social connection with our coworkers. What do those look like now?
And if I'm answering that yet, I don't know if I have the answer to that yet, but I think that that's, it's a similar response to what's happening, within those workspaces that we've tried so hard to make all of those natural collision kind of collaboration areas. I don't think anybody's willing to say yet those are not going to happen anymore, but they're not going to be used for a while. And so I think, is there a way to think about sort of transforming temporarily those spaces so there's still smaller gathering spots, but not kind of, it's just unrealistic at this moment in time. And again, is it 6 months? Is it a year? Is it 2 years? We just don't know yet that they're going to be those large gathering spaces. So I think we're in kind of a transition point with that.
And Mark,
yeah, I guess as a user of an office and somebody who likes to be with people. I mean, I to Felice's point, I think there's what I'd be willing to do right now. I'm not sure I want to be with 300 of my best friends in an atrium all standing shoulder to shoulder. But as we come out of this and think about the future, I hope that that is a big part of working together and collaborating and sort of just fundamentally being with people. I think that's important. So I sort of hope they don't go away, but I think we will in the future. I'm sure there'll be another pandemic. I think that that's sort of saying that that's happened. We've dodged it in the in the US in the past, but I'm sure there'll be another one. So I think we'll have a better protocol, I hope, for sort of shutting things down. But when it happens again, but I hope this doesn't mean that we can never never go to a restaurant again, never be with people again. I mean, I do like Arlen's idea of sort of letting nature take a breath. As a person that likes the outdoors, I have noticed I notice the sort of squirrels and rabbits sort of re-inhabiting things, but sadly I notice as we're into phase 2, lots of dead squirrels and rabbits on the road, and it's so we do need to I think work differently, but I do hope that we can those spaces will be used again in the future.
Could I say something in support of atria and grand staircases? There's a flawed analogy, but an analogy nonetheless to of course the campaign now for wider sidewalks and more bicycle lanes and larger open spaces because we can socially distance ourselves easier there. By the way, the thing that we haven't accounted for yet is the change in behavior, right? And actually, an atrium space, if we understand that we have to continue to be socially distanced to some extent, I think might be a better place to be than kind of in a little small in an elevator, right? The elevator is what I'm worried about, not the atrium actually. And in the way that my wife and I took a walk and noticed in Boston how people mostly still have their masks on, which is kind of amazing. In the way that, say, in China or in Japan, people who had a cold put a mask on out of their kind of social responsibility in a way, or being afraid of being, taken away by the police or something. So the point is, as our behavior changes, actually an atrium might be a pretty darn good space because it would allow you to be involved with a larger realm, but protect yourself in the way that you can because you're not going to go next to somebody else as much.
It's a really great point, and I was going to mention similar about stairs. I mean, avoiding, we're not talking about, high rises, but, avoiding elevators is a big thing, right? And so, designing in spaces that, as an active design and well-designed promotes already, the designing in spaces where the stair vertical circulation is really appealing and engaging in the primary kind of mode that gives people the way to, practice the social distancing, but also use that vertical circulation for more of a wellness experience too.
Yeah.
Cool. So I want to zoom out for a second. Judith asks the question, as we develop designs of spaces that accommodate safer ways to engage, how do we find ways to financially support their implementation, especially in academic settings that have the tendency to pass on delivery costs to the students enrolled? So, I mean, I think this question is a really good one because if we're paying attention to kind of the projections for where this pandemic is going, we're not really seeing ourselves coming out of this for 2 to 3 years down the road. As vaccines are developed and slowly pushed out to folks, it could be a while before we get back to normal. So I'd like to field this to Arlen first, and then over to maybe Alex to talk about how it could impact folks.
Sure.
That's a tough question. How do we financially support it? I think that's the $1 million question for a lot of things. I think that financially supporting sort of an academic solution, I can't help but think to look to other countries that are dealing with academics differently. I think about institutions who have incredible results, yet offer free tuition, such as our friends in Europe. And I don't know if this is necessarily answering the question, because I don't really have that background, but I think that there has to be some type of way to shift this economic debt that we have from quote unquote student loans to a way of providing accessible education for all. There has to be some type of shift. There has to be some type of give, some type of shift in thinking that needs to occur behind this to express the value of it.
So can I, again, maybe answer it in a slightly different way, not that I disagree with the comment. Actually, in terms of education, in terms of universities, maybe not sort of primary education, there's been a damn orgy of construction on campuses for the last 25 years as they've built, amenities and sports emporia and lounges and students. There's no absence of space on many university campuses, actually. You walk around a campus even when everyone's there, and there's lots of empty rooms, frankly. So given that the fact that there will be a continuation, probably even after the pandemic, of now a hybrid of in classroom and remote education, and that probably the number of people attending a particular university, not attending, but being in the university at the same time, will probably be reduced, again, even after the pandemic. I don't think space is the problem. Affordability is certain of education is a problem. Writing off loans is a problem. Getting access to those who cannot afford who have not been sort of prepared to apply for colleges properly and so forth. Those are much bigger problems than space. I don't think space, at least in the academy, is going to be as much of a problem as it actually might be in other circles. Back to things like affordable housing and so forth.
Chloe asked, how do you actually propose affordable housing when the market and area dictates the price of a home, and the maintenance and home technology changes so slowly to trend to those who need affordable housing? So as we're talking about, the affordability of things, I think Alex, your presentation did a really good job of showing, okay, this is really the American dream, but it's only really available to a select few, right? That opening map was really telling.
Yeah. The problem was that it was once affordable to the majority of Americans. It has increasingly become affordable to fewer and fewer people. That's why the inequality issues is the problem, right? Affordable housing, and again, some of it has to do with just geography, right? It's just harder to create 70,000 homes overnight in downtown Boston than it was out there, outside of New Jersey, right? Or in New Jersey, outside of Newark and so forth. So partially it's that. Partially it has more to do with actually the of course the increasing land values, again within desired areas. Partially it has to do actually with with union labor, even though I'm not going to get on a high horse against union labor and the increasing cost of that. Partially has to do with the cost of construction, which has been increasing kind of enormously as the need, if more people want to build, all of a sudden construction industry can also take advantage of that in terms of cost. So there are all kinds of, very kind of pragmatic issues involved in the additional difficulty of providing affordable housing. So that's that is perhaps one of the most difficult questions to address, and there's certainly no easy solution to that. However, let me also say that, guess what? The suburb was subsidized, without public roads, without sewer systems, without clean water, without the construction of the interstate highway system, without low-cost long-term mortgages, the suburb would not have happened. So there was a tremendous application of public support, not understood as subsidies at the time, but very much so. And we will need more of that right now on behalf of urban affordable housing. Right.
Zach, and out of the U.S. to talk about how that impacts people around the world.
Sorry, Rand, I didn't hear the question.
So Alex was talking about how, these affordable housing solutions may work in the US or not. Do you want to talk about how, maybe you've been thinking about affordable housing and economic resiliency worldwide?
I think that affordable housing and economic resilience worldwide. Most of my focus has been on climate, but when I think about affordable housing, I think of the co-op programs that are available for example, senior citizens and students. I think about a shake-up and a mix of programs. So, for example, students get free rent if they live with a senior citizen and donate consider an X amount of time to the senior citizen's well-being. So, for example, a student who has time to give could donate 10 hours a week to helping a senior citizen in need, whether that's literally just helping them make a meal or just spending time with that senior citizen. And there's this kind of this cross pollination of ideas that come from a mix with the youth and the elderly. And I think that if affordable housing can sort of take on a different spin in program, perhaps that's a way to rethink that system, to sort of provide an alternative route for expensive housing in an urban environment and still provide something for a necessary time needed for senior citizens. But obviously, given that it's a pandemic world, that's clearly changed, because we know that younger folks near older folks right now is just not really a good idea. So I think that's a really challenging question for me. I don't have too much to say other than just rethinking programs, rethinking. I think we need to rethink and redesign the conversations that we have around economics. I think we need to rethink and redesign the conversation that we have around affordable housing. I think that we need to really reshift our finances towards water solutions, towards green solutions. We need to understand that investing into green solution is the best solution, and there has to be multiple benefits to doing that. And I think until developers or folks that are investing into housing can see those benefits, it's not going to happen. And so there needs to be a change in this policy to make that happen.
We'll move on to a question from Scott Fulford, who asked, can any of the speakers comment on the value and importance of designed urban and otherwise spaces and landscape spaces in general in times of pandemic and social upheaval. And I'm going to ask really about the pandemic, but also, you know, we've had protests all across the country with thousands and thousands of people kind of taking control of their urban spaces, right? And I look to architectural history with the use of plazas in Rome and Florence as places of surveillance, Haussmannization in Paris as ways of, widening the avenues so that people can move through the streets. Not just people, but armed people in the military can move through the streets and they can see wide swaths. Do you see urban spaces and landscape spaces as a place where we can see change? Felice, do you see that in maybe the restaurant design or the childcare spaces that you're working with?
I think you're on mute, Felice.
Urban and landscape spaces of a kind of restaurant.
I've seen examples with restaurants taking over their street fronts, perhaps.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting right now because that's actually all they can do. So I think that one of the things that's been, one of those opportunities in disguise maybe is that, and this is happening with some of the restaurants that we're working on as well, is that where they had not considered outdoor space, now, since that's the only thing they're actually allowed to do, they're kind of, again, quickly pivoting. And it's, I think, turning into a very kind of positive outcome that now they'll have this connection to the neighborhood in a different way than they had before. And where that wasn't a priority in the initial design, then now it is. I mean, on the childcare side of things, one of the things that's impacting us from a kind of landscape and site perspective is that there's always been kind of a because of financial models, the need to keep things as small and efficient as possible. I think there's a bigger vision now for taking more space, taking more land, creating more outside classroom space in the months that we can do here in Boston, and thinking about grander space for the kids to be outside for the health reasons of it. And I think that even when this is sort of over, and it likely will be, and hopefully will be, that'll still be a positive outcome for the children's development. So it does have, even though we're focusing on a smaller scale, I think it absolutely has that kind of reach and impact on the spaces too, and a connection to that.
I mean, it's sort of, the answer is sort of, I believe that increasing the generosity and the quality of public spaces will support sort of humanity. So it goes without saying. I will point out just to be sure that the widening of the Parisian boulevards at the end of the 19th century was a way for Napoleon III to move troops to avoid social unrest, right? But the most beautiful example at the moment, it seems to me, was the painting of Black Lives Matter across 16th Avenue in DC. Wow. So to the extent that designers approach the environment in ways that could support citizen interaction in that environment, that would be a great thing to keep thinking about. How to make environments, whether they're interiors or exteriors or large open spaces, in support of the ability for people to use and transform and kind of rethink the way they might enjoy those environments. Yeah.
If I could just add, I don't need to go on video, but just to add to Arlen's, I think Arlen maybe sort of touched on it, putting value on things. For example, we struggle to put a value on the cost of carbon, and when you start to think about that it sort of fundamentally changes your decision. If using carbon comes with the cost right now, it doesn't. We price only fuel consumed, but the total sort of cost of carbon and its effect on the environment, when we start to sort of think holistically, it changes how it changes your approach. And I think, you know, I'm not a landscape architect, but I design systems in the buildings, but, you know, I'm lucky to have, you know, a yard and open space I can go to. I see my colleagues on calls that, you know, in small apartments and don't have, you know, that sort of space to go and sort of decompress and, you know, and take the kids or, you know, whatever it is. But if we can just start to think about, you know, how we value things, I think that sort of changes the decisions you make. And I think, you know, again, that sort of, you know, in 2020 reconsidering, you know, a place in the universe. I did like that slide. You know, I think that would be something else that I hope, you know, comes part of the conversation, is how we value things like that.
Well, I'm going to close with a question from Lynn. I'll post it up for you guys. And it says, other than simply being good citizens and supporting social justice, what are the special roles that designers should assume leadership positions to spawn positive change? So that's a pretty big question. But where do you see yourself fitting in that role, and what kind of advice could you give to other design practitioners or students?
I could maybe add a quick engineering comment. So I was on a call with some of my civil engineers in the office, our little team there. And it was interesting. So, you know, just looking at the social unrest, and they were saying that they just started thinking in the projects they do, you know, when you consider those kind of, you know, social issues, again, that sort of, you know, how does it change the decisions you make? So I think, you know, considering, you know, broadly than just where do I need to run this pipe, just, you know, the issues of the infrastructure on the, you know, the neighborhood, I think, you know, it really starts to sort of influence, you know, the right choice.
Given that we're almost out of time, I would say select your clients more wisely.
I think that now more than ever, it's incredibly important that we have designers that are able to visualize the future. I think that, you know, the people right now are very scared, and I think that if we can step up and allow folks to visualize what the future could be like in a very positive outlook, then I think that people can see the opportunities, and you'll start to see the change. I think once you actually put the pen to the paper and create an idea, it's no longer just a thought. It's becomes a conversation that needs to be had, and whether that conversation's turned into something that is actually implemented, I think that's incredibly powerful. So I think that as designers, we have an incredible responsibility and a role in this conversation to push it forward.
I'll just add one last thing, that we're just to always remember that while we're here designing, we're designing for people and communities. And no matter what is going on, we need to be informed and research-minded and always have the people's best outcome as our top priority.
Well, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Arlen. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Felice, for joining this excellent discussion. And thank you, audience members, as well, for joining us today. And I hope that you're able to stick around for some of the other discussions that are going on today and through the evening here in Boston. And with that, we'll sign off.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.